Welcome to our second National Academy Ask Me Anything of the Spring 2021 semester. My name's Keith Molenaar. So glad to be here with you today. I'm a NAC member and a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. The National Academy of Construction was established to recognize our industry leaders. And an important purpose of the Academy is to provide a network system of linkage between the past and present participants in the construction industry. As such, we have established this NAC AMA to help transfer knowledge to our next generation of construction leaders. That would be you. Thank you so much for joining us today. This spring, we're focusing our discussions on the NAC Executive Insights publication, those specifically around estimating. I'd encourage you to look at the NAC Executive Insights. You can just Google that, NAC Executive Insights, and you'll see a host of construction-related topics written directly for you, our rising professionals. So please use those resources. Let me talk about the format for our event tonight. It's really simple. Our speakers make a short presentation about a topic and their perspective on the industry. If you've not already, now is the time. Please send an email with your question to nacama@colorado.edu. Again, that's nacama@colorado.edu. You do need to send in a question to be eligible for our $500 scholarship, which we'll announce at the end of the event. So with that out of the way, let me introduce our speaker. I'm really excited to be talking to Bob Prieto. He's a senior executive and he's effective in shaping and executing business strategy. And he's a recognized leader within the infrastructure, engineering, and construction industries. Bob's currently chairman and CEO of Strategic Program Management, LLC, and serves on the Mott McDonald Shareholders Committee and is an independent member, and the Dar Al Raid Board of Directors. Bob's industry involvement includes the American Society of Civil Engineers Industry Leaders Council, the National Academy of Construction, and he's also a fellow of the Construction Management Association of America. He serves in a wide range of industry advisory panels, including the Millennium Challenge Corporation Advisory Board. And Bob previously served as Senior Vice President at Floor, Chairman of Parsons Brinckerhoff, and is one of 3 U.S. presidential appointees to the APEC Business Advisory Council. Bob, we couldn't be more excited to talk with you tonight. So I'll turn this over to you for a brief presentation before we jump into questions.
Thanks, Keith, and I'm glad to be able to join you and the students tonight. Let's get right into the presentation, because I know where you really want to get to are the questions and answers, and so do I. So let's go to the first slide, Jane. 2 out of 3 large complex projects fail. Now, as shocking as this sounds, it shouldn't be surprising. We see this same type of catastrophic failure in complex system after complex system. Think about perhaps the most complex system we live with every day, the nature around us. We witness so-called events of scale, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, and other such extremes at a much higher frequency than a normal distribution of such natural behaviors would otherwise suggest. And when we do experience them, their effects are catastrophic. The same catastrophic behavior was observed by Nassim Taleb, author of The Black Swan. When he looked at catastrophic behavior in large complex financial systems, he characterized those behaviors as black swans. Perhaps the most extreme of systemic risks. He suggested that they were perhaps unknowable beforehand, but even with that, we can keep a watchful eye on where they nest and breed. Let's go on to the next slide, Jane. Systemic risks exist both within our large, complex project environments, but also external to them. And while each of these risks may not represent a potential black swan, some may represent so-called black elephants, a cross between a black swan and the elephant in the room. Large complex projects are often characterized as comprising 50 to 100,000 activities and major programs may consist of multiples of such projects. So to help ensure that we're considering a full range of potential systemic risks, two acronyms are useful guides. The first, SMART, is focused on internal risks, while the second, ESPRIT, is focused on external risks. It was originally conceived for the large international development and construction projects, but has shown itself to be more broadly applicable. So let's look at each framework very briefly and how they are treated in detail in the executive insight on systemic risks that I think you were made aware of. So let's start with SMART. The acronym stands for Systems, Maintenance and Operations, Attitude, Risk-Taking, and Transitional. And we can talk more about each of these during the Q&A period. But the inward-looking SMART framework challenged us to recognize that large, complex programs or a project environment is an ever-changing, growing, and more complex system. This systems perspective is important, and it is something that is becoming more broadly recognized throughout the engineering and construction industry in particular, and broader industry in general. System risks arrive as the various systems, labor, materials, means and methods, and information flows are more tightly coupled together. Systemic risks also arise when we fail to recognize that tightly coupled systems must plan for contingencies, the unexpected, if you will. Worse, we do plan, but then we fail to keep the plans current and relevant. How we think about emerging changes and risks is all too often constrained by our own prior experience and willingness to consider different perspectives. Systemic risks are best addressed by a diversity of viewpoints rather than the most expert but overly narrow ones. Our willingness to take risks reflects not only prior experience, but institutional context. In actively failing in an effort to improve, but being rewarded as lessons are learned and shared, is that better, or is failing due to a lack of personal risk-taking the better course? These are some of the questions that we have to face when we think about systemic risks. Finally, change, even when addressing an emergent risk, must be understood to further stress the existing systems. Let's go to the next slide, Jane, and take a look at the outside world. So ESPRIT stands for economic, social, political, religious, intellectual, and technological risks. So looking at risks that arise from outside the project, we must begin with a simple truth. Gantt and Fayol's presumption of a well-bounded project is wrong, at least as it relates to large complex projects. The ESPRIT acronym provides a framework to look at the world influencing and impacting our project comprehensively. The surrounding economic situation may be the most obvious external set of factors, but even these must be thought of broadly. Social factors include stakeholders, but in many international projects, there are special considerations which arise from multinational labor forces or even the different cultures of client and contractor. One of these differing social norms may be related to bribery and corruption. Large, complex projects are magnets for political action, some well-intended, some not. So while changes in law and regulation may be more visible, delayed approvals may be even more impactful. Over the years, I've discussed the ESPRIT framework. As I've discussed it, the element that often causes the most consternation is the R for religious. If it's easier to understand, think of these differences as strong cultural differences. New ideas, belief sets, and cause célèbre constantly emerge. Some are transitory but impactful, while others persist and become new norms. Corporate social responsibility has morphed into ESG, and always watch for inflection points as these new ideas and belief sets begin to emerge. Finally, technology is always a risk, or perhaps better said, changes in technology. Intellectual property rights are not common, so understand what you truly have at risk. Let's go to the next slide. I'll close my comments where I began. Large complex systems and projects behave catastrophically. Said another way, they have fat tails. Yet our risk modeling tends to ignore these low probability, high consequence events. So let's make this concrete. A so-called 5 sigma event, 5 standard deviations from our mean, has a chance of occurring once in every 3.5 million instances. Rare indeed, and a good basis for ignoring the risk contribution from such an event. But if instead we believe large systems behave catastrophically and have fat tails, described in the charts on this slide as a Cauchy distribution, then that same event, that very impactful event, now has a chance of occurring once in every 16 instances. Maybe not so easy to ignore. So systemic risks are an important class of risks that demand our attention in large complex projects. And now my biggest risk is going to be trying to answer your questions over the rest of today's presentation, but I'll do the best I can. Back to you, Keith.
Well, thank you, Bob. Excellent presentation, and thank you for also writing the document. Before I jump into our participant questions here, I just wanted to ask you, you've written a lot of documents on the NIC website and other places. Why did you choose this one to present today, and what's drawn you to thinking about risk in this manner?
Yeah, so it's probably worth talking about the roots of the Esprit framework. At the time, I was earlier in my career, we were moving internationally and having to deal with new classes of risks. And so every opportunity that came up, somebody would come before me and explain, we have this risk, that risk, and the other risk. And it was hard to have a framework to make sure I was getting all the information I needed to make a go, no-go decision in pursuing a project. So the Esprit framework was created out of that. I've tweaked it a little bit over the years, but it's stood the test of time well, and I've taught classes just around the Esprit framework at a university setting as well. But systemic risks, I think, really become even more important today because we see a couple things. One, we see these large complex projects failing 2 out of every 3 times, and that's the actual failure rates. Failure here means cost or schedule overruns of over 20% against the original baseline. So these are significant numbers on significant projects. And the delays may be even more important than the cost impacts in many instances. But there's a second consideration beyond just trying to do better the projects we're already doing. We're facing some new challenges as a humanity, as a society, that are going to require us to take on even bigger risks, bigger projects, bigger change efforts, and more systemic risks. And a great one, which is very much in the news today, is trying to address the effects of global climate change. Global climate change is a systems problem. It's actually a system of systems problem. And yet we struggle doing large complex projects. So how are we going to get right a significant change that affects everything that we do? It means we have to think about what those risks are, think about the modeling of those risks, thinking about the mitigation of those risks, and recognizing one other attribute of large systems, the very systems that fail for us. They're not closed systems like Gantt and Fayol laid out, but they're open systems, which means the very goals of the project or the very goals around climate change will be emergent. They will change over time. And so we need to be shooting very accurately at a moving target. And that means understanding in real time not only the systemic risks we face, but their trajectories and the likely other risks that they may induce that don't exist today when we set out on this journey.
Well, thank you. I think the reading you picked and the topic is excellent. Yeah, I think you'll see by the questions from our participants, they've really taken a look and have some good ideas here. Let me start with a shorter one from Ashley. Ashley asks, at what point is a risk too large?
So think about a, a couple thoughts around that. So first, risk and reward must be balanced. So if you're looking for a really, really big payoff, you may have to take very, very big risks. But having made a decision to take on a risk, whether it's large or small, there are a couple things you want to do. The first is to make sure you understand the risk. And I will tell you, a lot of risks that materialize suffer from an incomplete understanding of what the risk was in the first place. Second, understand that the risk and our understanding of it are based on a set of assumptions. And I'll even stipulate that at the time those assumptions are made, they are picture perfect. They are the best possible assumptions. You'd have a hard time poking any holes into the assumptions that were made. But the nature of these programs is that they're long-lived. And one of the things that happens is assumptions migrate. And one of the failures in risk management is a failure to track assumptions and then to dynamically reassess your risks. So you want to manage risks, and you can't manage risks if they're not on your risk register, if you will. If they're not something you're paying attention to every day, periodically reassessing, either when something has moved too much for you or enough time has passed that it's appropriate to reassess it. When I think about the management of those risks, I've talked a little bit about tracking assumptions, but also in managing risks, we need to understand that as circumstances change, those risks will become coupled with other activities in a project or other risks. And they may not get coupled directly. They may be coupled indirectly through something that I refer to as constraint coupling. And I'll use an example here. So a very large program, we'll keep it very simple. There's 3 projects in the program. When the first project is finished, the second project begins, and the critical path flows through the first into the second project to completion. The third project starts after the first project begins and ends well before the second project ends, and it's not on the critical path. So now what happens is we experience a delay in that third project, the one not on the critical path. 6-month delay, still would finish even with a 6-month delay well before you hit the critical path on that, coming through that second project. So what happens? Is the program completed on time or not? Well, this is a real case. It wasn't. So how late was it? About 6 months. Why? Because that third program had a high demand for welders, the same as the second project in that program. And what happened is the 6-month slip put the demand for welders in exactly the same time period for a resource that was already nationally constrained in this particular case. So that constraint coupling is another way that ties risks together, and you really need to think about it. One last point. Your ability to assess the importance or the potential impacts of risk are only as good as the modeling. So I've talked about fat tails. I used the example of 1 in 3.5 million for a 5 sigma event versus 1 in 16. The problem is because we assume more normal distributions typically in our modeling, that 1 in a 3.5 million event, even if it's got a big impact, tends to get screened out as contributing very little to the overall risk of the project. But if it has a 1 in 16 impact, it's probably your most dominant risk. And the problem is, whether we provided for it financially or not, we stopped tracking it. And the failure to track and be aware of this potentially emergent risk, this catastrophic risk, puts us well behind the 8 ball in terms of managing and mitigating risks. So it's not the size, just to close out the question, it's not the size of the risk, it's your ability to characterize it, to model it effectively, to manage it, and to make sure that the reward and risk are appropriately balanced.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the illustrations. Scott here is asking a question about the reading. So with all the possible external systematic risks, how can a program manager effectively anticipate and plan for them? He wanted to know specifically also with the 6 categories, is there one that's more common or harder to anticipate? So maybe answer that question within the system that you presented.
Yeah, so let me speak first about external risks in general. And I'm going to do this by starting with a very brief definition of classical project management, if you will. So classical project management developed by Gantt and Fayol, if you will, built on some management work that was done by Taylor at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Gantt worked for Taylor. And so while Taylor was looking at building assembly lines to make things, Gantt was looking at the physical implementation of that assembly line. And Taylor viewed the world as being, or the assembly line being in a controlled environment, which it was. It was within 4 walls of a factory where the owner's project manager, the operator, and maybe even the financier of the project were the same guy. He was an entrepreneur. And decision-making was very short. The guy building the project had a problem. He went, he asked the owner's project manager / banker, and a decision was made and things went on. So for Gantt and Fayol, projects were well-bounded. What we see in these large projects in particular is projects are not well-bounded. And so these externalities become very important. Now, we make a mistake in managing, I'm going to use the term stakeholders to capture all those external groups for a second. We make an assumption that we can manage stakeholders. We talk about stakeholder management. There's a huge body of papers written on stakeholder management. I will go on record. I have 3 children. I have never figured out how to effectively manage any one of them. So what chance do I have managing a set of perfect strangers, if you will? None. So what's the best I can do? I can engage them. And by engaging them, I can learn of their interests, learn or anticipate their actions, and if I'm doing really, really well, influence how they may act with respect to my project. An analogy I use is Sentry Scout Ambassador. So the sentry standing at the boundary of the project, looking out at seeing what's coming at him. The scout is over the horizon getting a better feel, and the ambassador's out there with the tribal leaders trying to shape how they think about this project and how they're going to act with respect to it. So your ability to engage with this outside world of stakeholders requires a second understanding, which is the stakeholders themselves have stakeholders. So if you think about this external environment, it's kind of like this throbbing, almost amorphous mass of thoughts and ideas and feelings and emotions and actions. Another way of describing society and humanity in general. And out of that amorphous mass come what I describe as flows. Those may be actions, they may be ideas, they may be laws or regulations, but they arise from this throbbing mass. And because our projects are not well bounded, like Gantt and Fayol suggested they were, those flows come right through this semi-porous boundary of the project, and it plays havoc, not just on the tasks, the 50 to 100,000 tasks, but maybe even more importantly, on the 100,000 arrows connecting all of those projects. So in project management, we manage the activities. We don't pay enough attention, generally speaking, to the arrows. And that's where these projects get in trouble. And that's where the management of external risks is very much about understanding and managing external flows. I'll try to answer the second part of the question in terms of which of these external risks create the biggest challenges, if you will. Not economic, because you can hedge that. in a bunch of different ways, including potentially buying insurance, buying financial hedges, doing other things in project execution. Social aspects. Presumably you've done enough work to determine that the project can proceed in this setting. That doesn't mean you don't make mistakes, and it doesn't mean you don't have problems. And there are clearly examples of fatal mistakes being made in that area. Political, I'm going to come back to social in a second. Political, yeah, problems, religious, new ideas, new technologies. The most corrosive one is corruption. It is one of the biggest challenges, and I will argue the biggest challenge facing the global construction industry. It can exist as both a social phenomena as well as a political phenomena, depending where you are in the world. In some parts of the world, bribes are expected. And the easiest way to know where those are is there's a corruption index that I think World Economic Forum publishes every year. They update it. But there's an even better way. Look at your major U.S. EPC contractors and look at where they're not working. And that's probably not a bad indication that those countries fall in the too hard category for one reason or another. And corruption is often the leading cause, quite frankly.
Thank you. Excellent, comprehensive answer. I appreciate that. Helen has a similar question about the SMART acronym. Which one would you say is responsible for causing the most damage to companies and projects when things go wrong?
It's denial. I forget which attitude. It's under attitude. I stop and think, but it's denial. There's a great case history that has nothing to do with engineering. It's called the Man Gulch Fire. And I recommend it. It's just an interesting story. There's some papers out there online about the Man Gulch Fire. And it's about how a fire crew parachutes in to put out a emerging forest fire. And all but, I think, 2 members of the party perish in the process. But one of the major causes of people dying is denial. It's in their face. They can see what's happening, but it's not what they expect to be happening. So they deny it's happening. I talked about in my talk tonight the notion of black elephants. Black swans cross with the elephant in the room. You can see them. They're getting angrier by the minute, and they're about ready to charge, but you kind of ignore them, okay, because they're improbable. And then they trample you and your project to death. So denial is a major problem. I'll make one other point here. In looking at complex risks, I would rather have in the room not the expert on that particular risk, but a diverse body of thinking. So when I talk about the Esprit framework, a lot of times I'll use an analogy of it being like the Knights of the Round Table, where in each of those locations is sitting another knight. And each are looking to the center of the table at the feast, and each has a different perspective on what's in the center of that table. When you have a diverse set of viewpoints, you see things that you don't otherwise see. I'll use a personal example as well. So as a young engineer, first starting my career, we did on-board reviews of drawings. I doubt most of your audience has ever seen a drafting board, never mind ever having to use one or review a drawing on it. And there was a hierarchy when you did reviews. So all the senior people stood on each side of the designer, looking over his shoulder, and the young kid had to stand at the top of the board and look at the drawing upside down. It was a great way to look at the drawing because you were forced to look at things very, very closely. And I could routinely find things that were staring everybody in the face, but they couldn't see them because they weren't what they expected to see. I saw them because I had no expectations. and I had a very, very different perspective. So in managing these risks, whether they're Esprit or smart risks, that multiplicity of perspectives may be one of the best risk management strategies. And related to denial, if someone challenges conventional thinking, even if you think they're wrong, you need to hear their rationale because they just might be right, or they might just cause you to reframe your own thinking in the process.
Great response. Thank you. I think this question is actually related from Ashley, so I want to ask it. She's asking about cognitive lock. How do you fight against cognitive lock on a project when a team is working on that same project every day?
Yeah, it's again, this is where that diversity of views can help. So I'm going to take it from a project management perspective rather than a technical engineering perspective on this one. So from a project management perspective, one of the most important management tools are those monthly project reviews. First, that they happen. Second, that the right people are on those reviews. And the right people just don't mean your boss and your boss's boss. They mean people with different perspectives. So I'll use an example from a prior lifetime. When we went through these very brutal, very thorough monthly reviews on large at-risk projects, we had people sitting from legal, obviously from risk, from finance, from document management, people who are looking at very, very different aspects of project performance. And in the process, through their comments, we might see that what we thought was an obvious problem was not the obvious problem, that the real problem was something deeper. I want to give a second answer, maybe to open up a little different line of thinking. So we see today artificial intelligence being more broadly employed. And so your audience all have smartphones, and they all have Siri or whatever the equivalent of it is on their phone. That's a piece of AI. If you have Alexa in your home, you have a piece of AI. If you use face recognition to access your phone like I do, you have another piece of AI, visual recognition, voice recognition. When you think about the use of AI in looking at risks, looking at management of projects, you're basically just using a different type of AI. But I'd rather get lost in machine learning. I'm going to talk about visual AI. So I want you to think about, and the same is true on voice. So the underlying math on visual AI basically looks at the pixels in a picture, and it uses a set of math that creates a set of eigenvectors, basically, which take that two-dimensional picture and boil it down into a one-dimensional piece of math, if you will. So that it can then be compared against a huge library of other one-dimensional pieces of math, if you will. You can do the same thing on a project, and I have. And so in a project, if you think about, you have a number of different data streams you're collecting, costs, man hours, schedule related, whatever they are. And then you have the elapsed time, if you will, on the project. Then this two-dimensional picture of data value over time across all data values is a two-dimensional picture, and you can boil it down into a one-dimensional piece of math. And that one-dimensional piece of math can then be compared against other sets of risk or other sets of projects for which it's been trained. So in a project that I worked on where we engaged with the IBM Watson team, and we looked at a set of 100 mega projects using a common execution model, that was important. What we were able to see is that we could detect a failing project 2 months before the project manager was raising his hand saying, I think I have a problem. So what does that do? It gives you early insights into emerging risks. I mentioned in the context of cognitive lock because I have seen this technique employed where, despite AI saying, we think you got a problem coming at you and we think it's going to be significant, cognitive lock persisted in a number of the teams. What can AI know? We know better. We always do it this way. You can put all the other terms around it. So part of dealing with a cognitive lock is using new technologies which are increasingly available. And I definitely recommend it, because if you will, it becomes almost a God's eye view of that table around which diverse views are sitting. And it is yet another view that's not easily gained from any one of those perspectives. It can't tell you why the problem, it can just tell you this behaves like things that don't come out really, really well at the end. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Really wonderful answer with diverse perspectives and use of technology. Great thinking. Let's talk a little bit about mitigation and delivery methods and contingency. So there's a couple questions around there. I'll start with one on delivery methods. So Craig asks, do any of the systemic risks explained in the insights paper change with the different delivery methods?
Sure. So let's step back. At a fundamental level, the risks that the owner has to do a project are exactly the same independent of delivery form. The question then becomes, how much of that risk has he been able to shed or move or mitigate through some set of execution strategies? So, and I use the term execution strategies versus delivery model because there are non-delivery oriented execution strategies. So one simple example would be in a very, very large project, instead of building, I'm going to use my process terminology. So instead of building one train of 100% capacity, I'm going to build two 50% trains, or three 35% trains, or whatever the number is, which will potentially let me walk away if the market changed on me, for example. I can walk away from doing a full build out of the project. Now, will I pay a premium on that? The general thinking is yes, because you lose some of the economies of scale. I don't accept that. Or I'll say it differently. I don't think it's so clear, because I also believe that there can be diseconomies of scale. There's an executive insight that I've written that I don't know has been published yet on exactly this. So keep an eye out for diseconomies of scale. But the real question becomes, on different delivery methods, who is bearing the risk? And is the party that's bearing the risk the one who is in the best position to manage that risk? So I'll use a very simple example: design, bid, build versus design, build, if you will. So in design, bid, build, the designer develops the design, and the owner bids it out to contractors, and the owner effectively warrants to the contractor that this design is good. So the owner retains the design risk. Now, he may have shed some of that back off to the designer, and probably has tried to, but there will be certain classes of risk that he probably was unable to transfer to the designer when he first engaged the designer. Those are generally called spear-in risks, based on a, like, I don't know, many decades old legal case. And you typically see spear-in risks around undisclosed liabilities. So you should have known, or you couldn't tell me that risk, that underground risk, for example, wasn't present. So we agreed I would assume it's not present, and lo and behold, it's present, and I have to change my design, for example. Now in design build, that design is now being warranted, if you will, by the designer to the contractor. And at first blush, the owner is not involved in that design risk at all. It's directly now between designer and contractor, and the contractor's obligation, independent of whatever the designer did or didn't do, is to the owner and unchanged. Having said that, you can still get some elements of spear and risk even in a design build contract, but that's a little more esoteric, if you will. So the real problem on the selection of execution model is that it happens often at the wrong point in time. So the execution model is often selected before you've characterized the project and characterized the risks. So somebody says, well, we're going to do this as a PPP, or we're going to do this as a design build, or we're going to do this in this way. Well, quite frankly, you don't know enough to make that decision. And this is a mistake owners make. One of the things when I look at the shortcomings of classical project management, if you will, what Gantt and Fayol taught, and what I would call neoclassical project management. One of the weaknesses, there's three. One of the weaknesses is weak foundations going into a project. And two aspects of that. One is risk modeling, which I talked about in the presentation, but something even more fundamental. The owner is unable to articulate why he's doing the project. I did turnaround work on 18 mega projects, over 18 mega projects. In each of them, I conducted extensive management interviews. I'll just use one example. $25 billion program, 36 management people, owner, contractor, key suppliers, interviewed. Shortest interview, an hour and a half. Longest, 16 hours over 3 sessions. So these were in-depth interviews. Last interview, the COO, the guy responsible for the business. I asked him my fourth question in, you're going to spend $25 billion. What are you trying to accomplish by spending $25 billion? And I'm sitting across the desk from him and he says, well, I kind of know, but I don't know how to say it. And I wait a little bit. He doesn't add anything. I put a little dot next to the question on my paper and I start framing the fifth question. Halfway through framing the question, he interrupts me and says, no, we have to go back to the last question. I'm supposed to know the answer to that. I said, yes, you are. He says, well, I know you've talked to 35 other people before me. Did you ask them that question? I said, yes, I did. He says, well, what did they tell you? I says, they don't know either. He says, well, that's a problem. I says, no, that is the problem. So when I talk about projects not being well-founded, part of the jobs of a risk manager today, part of looking at those systemic risks are owner readiness, not just project readiness. The owner being able to say what he's trying to accomplish in a way that people can understand and get aligned around it. So we do project alignment, that's the how. But if we don't know the what we're trying to accomplish, we're really not going to get there. And it's not because people are going in opposite directions. They're going, just fingers slightly apart, and they're setting up this friction, and they're arguing over minutia, and the effect is delayed decision making, broken down relationships, and you can just go on from there. And in the case of that particular project, they had spent $6 billion out of $25 billion when I went in to do this. And my assessment is $1 billion of it was unnecessary money created because there was no alignment within the owner on what they were trying to accomplish.
Excellent answer. I really appreciate that. We're going to be running out of time here quickly. So many questions, but yeah, if anybody's on who hasn't sent in a question yet, please do, so you can still be eligible for our scholarship at the end. As I said, I wanted to ask you a little bit about contingency. Elizabeth has a question around there that's related to risk and risk assessment. So while it's important to renew contingency planning as the project evolves, how do you know when to reevaluate a plan?
Okay, so the first observation is that many large projects don't have a plan B. They have a plan A, and it's very, very well developed. And I can tell you about day 2 on the project that's out of date and irrelevant. So one of the things you have to do is identify, you can't use the rearview mirror. So your monthly project report or weekly project report is a rear view mirror. It tells you what happened. You need that over the horizon look of what's happening. So this really gets into looking not just at the velocity of the project, if I can use that term, the rate at which something's changing over time, or the acceleration or deceleration of the project. Is it getting faster or is it getting slower, and at what rate? And so that would be the acceleration, be the second derivative, if I have this right. Yeah, second derivative. You need to be looking at the third derivative. And the third derivative is the rate at which acceleration is changing. And that's actually called jerk. The next three derivatives are interesting. They're called snap, crackle, and pop, and I didn't make that up. But jerk is really where you need to be looking, which means deeper insights into what's causing. One of the problems in contingent execution, and there's two I'll mention. One is there is a tendency to want to return to the original plan. So think of it this way. You start falling behind, return to the original plan, fall behind, return. And you get this sawtooth pattern of project execution, which is very inefficient. Now, I'm not a sailor, but I know what happens when a sailor gets blown off course. He doesn't try to get back on the original course. He plots a new course to get to the end. And that kind of contingency planning needs to be dynamic and routine. You can identify triggers for it. So I would look at things like jerk, if you will, third derivative kinds of behaviors. I would also look at the impact of precedences. So unfortunately, a lot of these large complex schedules have too many precedences in the schedules. So A has to happen so that B can happen, so that C can happen, so you can do that thing on the critical path. And A goes bad, and next thing you know, you got a critical path problem, even though A, B, and C weren't on the critical path. So looking at that coupling, that constraint coupling, the precedence coupling, and trying to decouple projects is a good way to identify when you may need to be taking contingency actions. I'll give you an example on a way to deal with it. So real project, $6 billion North American transit project. 6 months into the project, 6 months behind schedule. Okay, no plan B. No understanding of why plan A was in trouble. Okay, because nothing directly on the critical path was in trouble. What was in trouble? The designer was not preparing the packages for utility relocations in the right sequence, because he had 5 utility companies he had to prepare packages for. So out of a 50,000 activity chart, he's got 5 lines that basically say begin and end for each of 5 utilities, 10 milestones out of 100,000 milestones, okay? But there were 600 discrete packages, each of which linked to different construction packages. And contingent execution would have told him whether he could work or not work that construction in a different sequence, given that he was receiving utility relocations in other than the planned sequence. One last point on contingent execution. Contingent execution is something you have to be prepared to do, but then you have to also be prepared to make an assessment, which is, does undertaking a piece of contingent execution raise the risk of project rework at a later stage? So this is really very much about risk looking forward and not backward. The risk profile, that S-curve that you get on the project, if you will, that S-curve doesn't stay the same through the project. Its shape changes, it's dynamic. Even if it goes from 0 to 100%, it's dynamic. The components of risk that make up that risk curve change with time. All that means you have to be looking at your risk, tracking your assumptions, being prepared to undertake contingent execution, and understanding what new risks you may be creating in the process of undertaking contingent execution.
Outstanding. I've studied contingency for quite a few years and helped build contingencies on projects, and I haven't heard that view, Bob. Thank you so much.
Keith, I'm going to have one last one. So I'm doing a project for the National Academy right now. I can't say the project name, or shouldn't say the project name, but it's a multi-$100 billion thing over, decades, if you will. And there were two terms being bantied about at different levels in the organization. One was contingency and the other was management reserve. You would think you were talking about four different things, not two different things. One of the parties had the definitions right. So make sure you understand the difference between contingency and management reserve and who owns and controls which.
Absolutely, yeah. Excellent advice. And all of this talk, Bob, has been spectacular for our participants, and I would encourage many of our NAC members to watch it as well. You've really been insightful. I want to ask you we're really out of time, unfortunately. I just realized. But I do want to end on one question. We've talked about some pretty deep and complex topics, but Puya asked a question I think it would be good to end on, and then you can also add a few words yourself. But the PDF document uses the acronym KISS. What does it stand for?
Keep it simple, stupid.
Well, I really appreciate that. Anything you'd like to close on before I do a few thank yous and announce our winner?
Look, first of all, I think for the students, whether they were required to listen to this or not, or they're just on for the scholarship, that would all be good motives. But hopefully what I've done is try to get you to think about the bigger picture. It's very easy to see the trees. It's harder to see the forest, and maybe even harder when it's on fire. So go look up that Man Gulch story. I think you'll enjoy it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bob. We really appreciate your preparation. And I personally want to thank you for all of the contributions you've given to NAC Executive Insights in the industry as well. You've had a great career, but you've given back so much. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. I wanted to also thank Jane Manalo for organizing this, and Sandy Pittman, Wayne Crew, and actually all of the NAC members for making this possible and contributing from not only their experience, but their financial resources as well for the scholarships that go for this. So I wanted to let you know the winner, and that's Gustavo Gutierrez from the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. So congratulations, Gustavo. And Jane will be in contact with an email, and we will tell you how to get you that scholarship so you can continue your education. Again, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. Hopefully you can join us next month. We have two more left. Chris Traylor with Traylor Brothers is going to talk about pricing of work as a team, joint venture estimating, and then Dr. Cliff Schneck-Schneider, who may have written textbooks that you use in your classes, is going to talk about bidding unit price work and use the Hoover Dam as a case study. So I hope you can join us again. And Bob, thank you so much for your time.
Take care, Keith. This is a great series you're running.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.